Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be back after 2 weeks. I apologize for the break in our kviut, in the regularity of our sessions. Simply last week I was in the midst of a very important meeting which affected the lives of other people, and I wasn't able to take time off and for us to teach. That doesn't happen very often. If some of you were indisposed as a result, I do apologize, and I don't believe it will happen again. And if it does, I will try to give excuse me, give up the give an advance warning. We are about to embark on a crystal clear example, or a sterling example, of a phenomenon that I mentioned at the very, very beginning of these shiurim. Seems a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, regarding the nature of Pirkei Avot and regarding the commentaries thereof and the way that we interact with this specific Masechta. I will repeat, I'm not expecting anyone to remember what I said a year and a half ago. One of the things which is remarkable about Masechet Avot is the fact that overwhelmingly the passages, the Mishnayot, are very clear. They're very straightforward, seemingly not needing any interpretation. And because of that, they bear all kinds of levels of meaning. So that as a result, over the centuries, since the redaction of the Mishnah, at least around the year 220 CE by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, different generations of commentators in different places have in fact derived different messages from the words of the Mishnah, or see the words of the Mishnah reflecting contemporary concerns of theirs. So that when we look at the Mishnayot, we can not only try to understand what the words per se are saying, because they could mean many, many different things, but also to try to appreciate and to try to get into the heads, get into the worldview and the experience of generations that have come before us. That's a very exciting thing. It's because it's a combination of history and hashkafa, which is one of the reasons why that's what this shiur is called. And the Mishnah that we are going to look at today, which is going to take us a few weeks. It's interesting, even though it's very straightforward, apparently nothing to say, it will take us a few weeks to really work through it properly. This Mishnah is a sterling example of that. We are in the second chapter of Avot. We are in the 13th, according to most countings, the 13th Mishnah. And the Mishnah says as follows: Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, Havei zahir b'kriyat Shema u'v'tefillah. Be careful, be scrupulous, be cautious with the reciting of the Shema in the morning and evening, and with prayer. That's part one. Ukshata mitpalel, and when you pray, al ta'as tfilatcha keva. Don't pray by rote, or don't use the same words all the time, which is, you'll see, is problematic since there are standard, more or less standardized prayer books. Ela rachamim v'tachanunim l'fnei hamakom baruch hu, but rather your prayer gesture, your moment of prayer should be characterized by or consist of beseeching and entreaties and asking for mercy before God, as it is said, Ki chanun v'rachum hu erech apayim v'rav chesed v'nachem ala ra'ah. For God is compassionate and merciful, long forbearing and abundant in kindness, and nicham ala ra'ah. We'll have to look at what that means. Also regrets evil. The problem with that is God doesn't change his mind, ostensibly. There's no change in God. It's going to be a real issue. That's number 2. Don't be down on yourself. Don't always say, I'm wrong, something wrong with me, I'm bad, I was the wrong one. This is a very important admonition that we should try to develop a positive self-image of ourselves, or at least a realistic self-image of ourselves. So you can see that this is a very loaded Mishnah, and it's going to take us a while to work through it. So let's start with the first section. Havei zahir b'kriyat shema u'b'tefillah. Already from the get-go, we have a problem, not with what the words mean, because it's seemingly self-evident, but rather what words are there here. Because there are two very different versions of this Mishnah. One, the earliest and most authoritative version of the Mishnah, the Kaufman manuscript, does not have the word tefillah. Havei zahir b'kriyat shema, period. Doesn't mention tefillah, doesn't mention prayer. Later on, other manuscripts have the word tefillah. And that makes a very big difference in terms of what this statement is. If the word kriyat shema is here, that means that there's a special, for some reason, Rabbi Shimon is here trying to say something about there are areas of, or some aspect, or some facet of reciting the Shema in the morning and the evening, which requires special caution, special care, special consideration. And only in the second section does he get into the question of prayer as an experience, that you should make it rote and so on. If, however, the word tefillah is part of the Mishnah, then it means that it can mean one of two. It can mean one of many things. It can mean be careful both with regard to Shema and the reciting of the Shema and prayer, or it can mean each one as a unit. In other words, kriyat shema and tefillah that go together. And another one is that each one have their own challenge, but they're similar. Similar challenges, that's why they group together. Now, when the word tefillah appears here, let me just define terms. Tefillah can be a generic, meaning that it refers to prayer as an entity. You pray. More likely, it doesn't refer to generic prayer, but to hatfilah, the prayer par excellence, with which in Judaism is the Shemona Esrei, the standardized, or more the standardized structure from a structure point of view at least, prayer, which is made up of 18 or 19 brachot. It's sometimes called the Amidah because you say it's standing. Sometimes it's called the Shemona Esrei, the 18 brachot, even though there are 19. But it means the prayer par excellence. It's interesting. I once encountered an example. There are many such, but this one brings to mind. I once, when I was, I think it was at my doctoral defense, which was, God help us, 30 years ago, a little bit more. We were, after I passed my defense, so there was like a little luncheon that we had. And I recall that one of my friend and colleague was also one of the judges of the thesis, Professor Bernard Septimus, noted that the use of the word tefillah actually, as a technical term, meaning the tefillah par excellence, is it can provide us with a perfect example of why, if one wants to study Judaism, even academically, then you need to have not only a very good secular education, but you need to have a vast, and extensive at least, rabbinic and traditional education. And he gave an example which I thought was stunning. One of the great scholars, one of the great students of Maimonides' philosophy was the late Shlomo Pines, professor at Hebrew University. And he actually translated the Guide for the Perplexed, the Mar Nevuchim, from Arabic into English, and did it in such an amazingly excellent way that Professor Twersky, Zichron Levrach, I remember, mentioned that it's so precise that you can actually attribute significance to every single word as if you were reading the original, which is the way that original documents were written at the time, with precision and with maximum meaning borne by a minimum number of words. And that generally is true. But Professor Septimus at the time noted, he said, but sometimes you need to know a little Torah to be able to do this too. There is one passage in the second section of the guide where Maimonides discusses salat. Salat in Arabic means prayer. That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam is salat. And those of you who might know a little Aramaic or know Aramaic know that the word for prayer in Aramaic is tzluta. It's from a similar, from a cognate root. In any case, Pinas translates the word salat as prayer, as a generic. And Professor Septimus pointed out that if you look at Maimonides' formulation, it's obvious that he's not talking about some generic type of amorphous prayer, but rather the proper recitation of the Shemona Esrei, of this tefillah, of this tefillah writ large, of the Shemona Esrei. So you have to be careful to this. Generally speaking, in the Mishnah and certainly in Chazal, in general, the word tefillah means this established sort of obligatory prayer. All right. So, how are we going to read this Mishnah? We're going to read it with tefillah or without. We're going to read it all 3 ways because some of the commentaries have the word tefillah, and some of them don't, and they interpret accordingly. But let's start with the way that it's written in the earliest manuscript, and that is without the word tefillah. So Rabbi Shimon, one thing that he was noted for saying was, Havei Zahir b'Kriyat Shema. Be careful about Kriyat Shema. What's to be careful? You say Kriyat Shema in the morning. I mean, and in the evening. What does it mean Havei Zahir? So it's interesting. A lot of the commentaries in the High Middle Ages, they don't even really pay attention. They said okay, that's a given. You should be careful with Kriyat Shema. But what does it mean? So in the 11th century, or the early 12th century, the commentary, which is attributed to Rashi, it's not Rashi, but came out of that milieu, says, be careful that the time doesn't go by that you say Kriyat Shema on time. Because Kriyat Shema is one of those funny things. I mean, at night, evening Kriyat Shema is easier, because you start saying it, the time to start saying it is when you go to lie down, which at the time is around, which is nightfall with 3 stars and so on, and it's good. You're good to go until dawn. But in the morning, it's stickier because the earliest you can say Kriya Shema is a little bit, maybe 15, 20 minutes before sunrise, and it goes until the third hour, which is a couple of it changes because we're talking about relative hours, not absolute hours, not days that are automatically divided into 12 parts, or into 24 equal parts. So be careful. So that's what bothered. That's how this commentary attributed to Rashi interprets it. Why is that a concern? Well, the truth is, it's still a concern. People oversleep. And there are various times of the year, in the winter especially, that it happens early. Just be careful with the times. Now, the truth of the matter is that there's entire literature among Ashkenazic interpreters, at least, which talk about the problematics of telling time in a world without a mechanical clock. They didn't know there was such a thing as a mechanical clock. So it may very well be that this saying, get up early, do what you have to do on time and whatever, don't put it off until later, don't go to work early, whatever the case may be, daven first, that might be what's reflected here. Because the word Haveza here could mean, be careful, could mean anything. As it seems to be indicated by the fact that a lot of commentaries sort of gloss it over and go straight to the question of what's the proper stance for prayer. Interestingly, that's up until the 19th century. 19th century already, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, in his commentary to Tiferet Yisrael, which is very contemporary. In other words, his contemporary life in 19th century Europe is he's very much aware of enlightenment and modernity and so on. He says, I don't understand the saying Zahir, be careful. He says, of course you have to be careful. It's an obligation. why? So what kind of care? It's not a matter of like care. If you're not careful, it'll be fine. No, if you're not careful and you don't do the mitzvah on time, then they don't have the mitzvah. And how are you going to? I mean, it's an obligation. How are you not going to? How are you not going to fulfill your obligation if you don't do it on time? Zahir is too mild. It's too namby-pamby. It's too easygoing a statement. So it can't refer to the basic obligation of just saying Kriya Shema because things are too important there. So he says, and this I think reflects a reality of declining Jewish literacy, or well, maybe declining Jewish literacy. He says, no, it doesn't mean that. It means that you have to take your time, learn Hebrew, get to know what the words mean. Don't just say things by rote. It's very nice to pray. It's very nice to pray and be in shul and so on, but you've got to take your time and study tefillah. You've got to take your time and study what the words mean, because the Jewish outlook on life and how we address God and how we deal with each other, all of that is tied up very much in the siddur. And that indictment is an indictment which is true of today too. We don't study prayer enough. We don't study tefillah enough. So then, of course, people are bored. They don't know what they're saying. But in order to do something properly, you need to be able to you need to study it and know what the words mean. And that's what he's saying. Hevei Zahir, treat it carefully, treat it gingerly, treat it with personal involvement. I'm not going to turn my back on everybody, but I just recently got a book in the mail by how you get books nowadays. A book by a former teacher of mine, whose name was Rabbi Isaiah Volgamut, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who was actually my first teacher in Gemara. And he wrote a book called Birei Tefillah, because at the Maimonides School in Boston, where he taught for many, many years, he gave a course called Birei Tefillah, interpreting or commentating on the meaning of the Tefillah. He did it with Rabbi Soloveitchik Zatzal's not just encouragement and supervision and input. And it's a lovely introduction to exactly what the tefillah is, and I really highly recommend it. And I don't get I get no percentages. I really, really recommend that you get it for this reason. Hevei Zahir b'kriyat Shema. But so you see, for example, so it's interesting. So what is of concern to a rabbi, to a commentator in the 11th century in Germany, is making sure people fulfill their obligation. In terms of, let's call it quantitative, perhaps. On the other hand, if you look at what Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in the 19th century is, he's not so much concerned about people fulfilling obligations, but the qualitative way in which they do it. People have to be thoughtful. Now, the truth of the matter is that in this difference of approach to the same words may very well be related to something else, and that is that in the 19th century, Jews were challenged by alternative cultural and cultural trends and ideas, and things came up, and they were culturally illiterate from a Jewish point of view. They didn't know why they did things, or how they did things, or how the Torah might respond to contemporary challenges. Sound familiar? And therefore, it may very well be that this issue of qualitative understanding of the Shema, which is the Daksa, which is the central declaration of faith, and the three passages in the Shema, really contain within themselves in miniature, almost the entire gamut of Jewish thought and all of the issues of Jewish philosophy, if properly understood. And according to Chazal, there are hints to all 10 commandments also in the three passages. That may be, his emphasis on understanding may very well be his saying understanding the words may very well reflect that kind of cultural challenge. And it's not, there's something very contemporary about it today, because to a large degree, I've said this many times here, I've published about this, both rabbis and laymen have no idea how to respond to postmodern or contemporary liberal or progressive or whatever challenges to the Torah, or contemporary cultural kind of challenges to the Torah, because they have no idea how to bridge to elicit that kind of response from the words of the from the it's called the Jewish Library, the Avot from Yehudi, and or be able to create a common cultural language that would allow them to engage. My teacher, Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, was very much on the same team when it comes to this Mishnah. Now, he didn't say it about this Mishnah, he said in the context regarding this question of understanding that the Zahir must mean you must understand. And his position on the significance of Kriyat Shema, which he lays out in two very long chapters of a book called Shiurim L'Zecher Rabba Mari. It's a collection of Yortzeit Shiurim that he gave up until 1979. The first chapter is about Kriyat Shema. The first two chapters are about Kriyat Shema, although I don't think he gave them as drushes. I think he actually just wrote essays and then they were tacked on to the actual lectures. In any event, in those there and elsewhere, he discusses the point that when one says Kriya Shema, one has to be aware of what exactly one is saying and what exactly the ramifications of those declarations are. So that is what I'd like to get to now. And of course, in typical Rav Soloveitchik fashion and his entire family, the point of departure is Maimonides. In this case, we're discussing a passage in Maimonides, which is let's see, it's the first chapter of the laws of Kriyat Shema. The first three halachot. The Rambam says as follows: Pamayim b'chol yom, twice a day, korin Kriyat Shema, you recite the Shema, ba'erev u'bavoker, in the evening and in the morning, because the day starts the night before. Shnei Amar, as it says, u'v'shach b'chav kumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up, in the first chapter, the first paragraph. B'shah shederech b'nei adam shochvim, v'zehu laila, when people generally go to sleep, and that's at night. B'shah shederech b'nei adam omdim, and at a time when people generally get up, that's the daytime. Okay, that's straightforward. Umahu koreh, what does he read? Shlosha parshiot, he reads three separate paragraphs. Elu hein, and these are they. Shema, v'haya im shamoa, vayomer. The first is v'yahavta, and then comes v'yam shamoa, which refers to sachar v'onesh, or reward and punishment, and then the parsha of tzitzit. And then he says as follows: Umakdimim likrot parshat Shema. You first read the parsha of Shema and v'yahavta. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. Mipnei sheyesh ba yichud Hashem, because it contains a declaration of the absolute and uncompromising oneness of God. Ve'avato, and the love of God. V'talmudo, and the obligation to study Torah. Shehu ha'ikar hagadol shakol talui bo, because that is which is the major principle upon which everything depends. We're going to come back to that. Ve'achareha v'yayim shamoa. After that, the second passage talks about observing mitzvot. Sheyesh ba tzivui al shar ha-mitzvot, which is an overall injunction, commandment to observe all the rest of the mitzvot. V'achar kach, and after that, the parsha of tzitzit, shegam hi yesh ba tzivui chirat kol mitzvot, which demands you not only to observe the mitzvot, but also to remember the mitzvot. And then in the third thing, he says also there's an element of remembering the Exodus from Egypt. We'll come back to that. Not today, next time. I'd like to zoom in on his characterization of why the parsha of Shema and Be'ahavta comes first. Now, the Rambam here has recast a Mishnah in Masechet Avot, in Masechet Brachot. The Mishnah in Masechet Brachot quotes Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha was the son of Rabbi Akiva. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva was bald, so they called him the son of the bald person, Baldy. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha says, why is it that Shema and V'ahavta comes first and not V'ha'im Shemoa, because he says Kadesh Yekabel Latzmo Ol Malchut Shamayim Tchila. The first thing one does is to declare one's loyalty, one's fealty, one's submission to an acceptance of the yoke of heaven, of God's dominion, and then v'achar kach yikabel ol mitzvot. In other words, first you commit yourself to God and to everything He says, and then you go to the details of all the other mitzvot. What's striking is that Maimonides takes this expression, all mitzvot yikabel of all mitzvot. All malchut shamayim, that you accept upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. You commit yourself to God first, and he changes it. He doesn't say that he should accept the yoke of heaven. He breaks it into what he sees as its component parts. He says umakdimim likrot parshat Shema. Why? And then he defines what the three elements of Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim are. What it really means to commit yourself to God, to commit yourself, to accept upon yourself the yoke of heaven. The absolute unity of God, as opposed to paganism, as opposed to Christianity, as opposed to whatever. Okay, Avato, maybe you have to love God. Now, in the Rambam's language, loving God means to study science and study the world, and to develop an inner relationship of not just an emotional but also an intellectual relationship with God. But then he says v'talmudo, studying Torah, and it's Talmud Torah, which is the ikar hagadol shekol tolua, which is the major principle upon which everything depends. Rav Soloveitchik used on many occasions explained this combination of these three things this way. When we commit to God, we are basically saying we accept His rule. And we may have questions, that's difficult for people to obey, but we make an a priori commitment to God's oneness, to loving God and seeking an intimate relationship with God, to the degree that's possible, and also to His Torah, which means an a priori acceptance of the Torah and faith in its justice, faith in its truth, and everything depends on that, because people will be undone by deciding that they can judge the Torah rather than have the Torah submit to the Torah's it dictates. Now, that doesn't mean there's not room for interpretation, but at some stage of the ballgame, it happens to everyone, even though it's difficult to understand. And there were cases where Rav Soloveitchik said he didn't understand it. You submit to God's will because God's will is greater than we are. So, in other words, the Haveza here b'kriyat Shema then would mean that be careful to understand and appreciate the ramifications of what you are, not just to say kriyat Shema like a tuki, like a robot, but to accept with a full heart the kingdom of heaven, and to enter into as a like a feudal lord, like a vassal goes to the feudal lord and puts his hands between the hands of the lord and says, I'm your person, I'm your man, I'm your woman, and everything comes from that. Interestingly, and this is all kinds of ramifications, all kinds of other places, that the point of departure is always commitment to God first. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that Nachmanides, at least Nachmanides quotes an earlier opinion. It says that there can't be a mitzvah to believe in God. It's an a priori commitment to belief. And a priori commitment, and once you do that, then everything comes as a result. But then you accept God's dictates. So that, and why did Rav Soloveitchik emphasize this so much? Specifically because he started developing this theme in the 1970s, when individual skepticism and the kind of radical autonomy that so common today began to take hold even in the Orthodox world. I said, no, in advance you need to. Shema means accepting the yoke of heaven, working within the system, working within the world of the Torah, having questions, but not judging God's word, and that's the framework. That's the point of departure. That's Hevei Zahir, B'Kriyat Shema. It'll also, in light of that, by the way, that means that, and here it's sort of like I would say Al Derech Hadrush. You do this twice a day. It means your day is framed by the renewal of your commitment to God. Each Kriyat Shema, in the morning and the evening, is an independent action. They do not depend on each other. They do not depend on each other. In other words, if I say Kriyat Shema in the morning and I fall asleep in the late afternoon, I sleep through the night. Okay, so I don't lose the morning Kriyat Shema because I missed the night one. Each one stands on its own. However, strikingly, Maimonides, and Maimonides says it's still one mitzvah, because the mitzvah in its plenitude, the mitzvah in its completeness, is to frame all of the times of one's existence with a declaration a priori of commitment to God and accepting the yoke of heaven. That's a very hard, in a world, in a scientific world where everything is skepticism and minimalist, that's a very difficult position to maintain, but it is nevertheless the point of departure for all of Judaism, and that's another reason why the Rambam says shehu ha'ikar gadol shekol tolui bo, because that's the major principle upon which everything depends. Okay, there's much more to say about this Mishnah. We will talk about it more next week. In the meantime, have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Try to stay away from Omicron. And if you're Chalila infected, take care of yourselves and indulge yourselves to get better. And we will see you next week. Bye.